This is Mark Burgess again with the Department of Commerce, Office of Employment and Training. Welcome back to the WIOA Wednesday Webinar series. This week we're going to be speaking on MOUs and cost negotiations. It's a follow-up to a presentation done about 3 weeks ago. As always, the presentation is available in the files pod to the left for download and printing. Also, we will mute all of the telephone lines until the end of the presentation, at which time you will be able to ask questions or make comments over the telephone. But in the meantime, you can put any of your comments or questions in the chat pod to your left. We have the presentation today being provided by Kerberak and Breckel. Skip and Christy are here to present that. And so with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Skip. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark, and good morning, everybody. As Mark mentioned, this is really a follow-up to the April 6th webinar where the focus was on MOUs and cost negotiations. Subsequent to that webinar, as everybody should know, there was a fairly detailed MOU FAQ that was developed and made available and is on the portal. And most of the questions, if not all of them, that were raised in the last webinar can be found on that that MOU FAQ. Today is, there'll be a very short presentation because the purpose of this webinar and the one that follows on May 11th is primarily to provide an opportunity for local partners to ask questions of clarification regarding MOUs and cost negotiations. But there will be a brief presentation I will make, and the next slide tells you identifies what I'm going to talk briefly about. First is the MOU FAQ, and then one thing that we decided subsequent to the April 6th webinar is that it's probably a good idea to spotlight an area in which there seem to be a number of questions. And so for today's webinar, the spotlight is on questions about FTEs, so I'm going to review some of those questions and answers in a little bit of detail, but not much. And then I want to just mention the status of what's going on at the state level to prepare for the review not only of MOUs, but also of regional and local plans, and then cover the reminder about some upcoming deadlines. So that's what we're going to cover briefly. With regard to the MOU FAQ, this slide shows the way in which the questions on the MOU FAQ are categorized. They're not in that order, but those are the categories of questions. And I hope everybody had an opportunity to review those questions and responses, and if there's a need for clarification about any of those, we can do that today. Moving then to the spotlight on FTE questions, full-time equivalents. Printed on this next slide is the actual question from the MOU FAQ. And it asks if each program commit a minimum of 1 FTE since services have to be available at a comprehensive one-stop center during normal business hours. And the answer to that is no, that's not required. The requirement is that each partner provide staffing that's sufficient to enable the services that are required to be available at one-stops, that each partner provides staffing sufficient to ensure that services are available. And those staff, as we know from previous information, can be on-site or off-site and be available via technology that meets the direct linkage requirement. So a partner's minimum contribution may be less than, equal to, or more than an FTE. Again, that's something to be worked out locally, and there is no defined standard at a state level that suggests what the floor or ceiling on FTE contributions are. The next slide provides a hypothetical example of, in this case, it's IDES as a partner that has responsibility for multiple programs IDES is not the only partner that that has responsibility for multiple programs, but this slide shows hypothetically how IDES in a one-stop could fulfill its responsibility to make services available at a one-stop with fewer than one FTE. So it's, again, fractional dedication of staff is allowable, is actually inherent in the definition of what an FTE is, and really depends on the determinations that are made locally about what the demand for service is going to be. There are other ways that a partner can fulfill its obligation to make services available through one-stop centers. One of those is, there was a question about cross-training and whether that's a possibility, and yes, it is. So again, as you work it out locally, it is possible for staff in one program to provide access to services in another program, provided they are trained to do that and have the capability to do that. And that cross-training and that staff contribution where that happened would, again, be part of local MOU negotiations, as is really everything. The question continues to come up about whether FTEs are the required method of allocating costs, and the answer is no. FTEs are still being encouraged at a state level as the method for allocation, and one of the reasons for that is that under the governor's guidelines, as you may recall, when we get to PY17, FTE contributions are going to be the basis by which the governor decides on each partner's proportionate share. So part of the rationale to encourage FTEs as the basis locally is to keep that aligned with what's going to be happening at the state level in the limited arena of the state infrastructure mechanism. And as we all know, that whole business of infrastructure cost sharing and state and local mechanisms, the effective date of that has been delayed until the beginning of PY17. So let me just shift gears in. That's a little bit of additional detail about FTE contributions, as there were a number of questions you saw in the MOU FAQ document related to that. Now, just real briefly, I want to cover where we are on the preparation for the review of regional and local plans and MOUs at the state level. The first thing to know is that there's been a new working subgroup of the state WIOA interagency work group developed that will have the responsibility for reviewing regional plans, local plans, and MOUs. This new working subgroup will have the lead responsibility for doing that. The core partners are certainly represented on that subgroup, and each other required partner has been invited to identify someone to work on this group. This group has met once last Friday, and the details of how this is going to work and the timetable are in process, and there will be a communication, we hope very soon, that will describe for everyone how, at the state level, the review of regional local plans and MOUs is going to work, and what you can expect that process to look like, and the timing of it. When I say soon, I'm hoping that that will be soon after the next meeting of the interagency work group, which is scheduled for next Wednesday, the 4th of May. So either by late next week or early the following, the hope is to have information available to you describing how the review process is going to work at this state level. Enough about that. And then finally, just a reminder of some of the deadlines that are relevant to to this, to you that are upcoming. April 30th, which is really May 2nd, given that the 30th is on a Saturday. The preliminary budgets are due to Mike Baker, so that's something to remember. According to the time frame for development of regional local plans, May 1st was the target date for having those available and posted for public comment. May 31st is the date on which the outcome reports that are described in the governor's guidelines, this is the outcome of the results of your local negotiations, are due. That's May 31st. Any local area which does not agree, the outcome report they submit suggests that they were unable to reach an agreement, then the 45-day period that's described in the governor's guideline begins. In the middle of June, the regional teams will be updating the plans based on the public comments received during the public comment period. By June 30th, the initial regional and local components of the plan are finalized and approved and submitted again to Mike Baker. And then by July 15th, local areas that were unable to reach agreement, that 45 period comes to a close, and for those areas that did reach agreement, the MOU is due again to Mike Baker by July 15th. So that's the extent of the presentation for today, and would like to use the remainder of the time today for your questions of clarification regarding the MOU and shared cost negotiation process, including new questions that came up subsequent to the release of the MOU FAQ on April 12th.
Okay, we've got a few questions, Skip. The first one is, can the FTE number be different for the infrastructure and system costs? They would like to separate the two spreadsheets to allow for this as negotiated locally.
Well, you know, just thinking about that, there is the spreadsheet, I believe, is set up so that the basis for allocation that you select, FTEs, would apply to both shared costs and infrastructure costs. So the question is whether you can use a different method for one or the other, or do you have to use the same method for both? Is that the question?
Pat, excuse me, Pat, would you like to expand on that? And Chelsea, why don't you go ahead and unmute all the phone lines since we're in the question session, and if Pat wants to do it over the telephone, she can do that. We'll move to the next question at this point in time. Is it possible for them to get a list, the local areas get a list of who's going to be on this work group?
Sure.
Okay, we can have Christy send that out to the entire individuals.
And it could be, that might be incorporated into the communication that's going to come out after the May 4th meeting that explains the process. That's probably a better time to do it, would be to, you know, to have it all be part of a single communication describing the process. But yeah, there's no secret.
Okay.
About who's going to be involved.
And then a question to Mike, who is with us, Mike Baker. Are you going to provide feedback on the preliminary budgets, and if so, maybe when would they expect that?
Yes, that's going to be looked at by the review team, and so we'll be getting back to folks once that's done, so that'll be shortly, but no definite date set for that. It'll be before they have to do their final budget for the MOU.
And just a reminder of the context of that, too, is that the preliminary budgets due on April 30th or May 2nd do not necessarily have to be agreed upon at this point. So don't delay your submission thinking that you don't submit until there's agreement. Obviously, the hope is there's agreement, but the expectation and desire is that there's a submittal of a preliminary budget, whether there's agreement or not.
Does anyone have any questions they would like to present over the telephone line? All of the lines have been unmuted, so if you have a question or comment over the lines, especially Pat Farah, if Skip did not address your question on FTEs sufficiently, if you could please expand on that question so that we can make sure you get the answer that is necessary.
Yeah, this is Pat Farah. Can you guys hear me? Am I unmuted?
Yeah.
Okay, great. What we're thinking is we are going to use the FTE model for this year, for the year that starts July 1. We're not waiting till next year, but we do see that we'll, we want to give a little bit of flex to those partners that are not core partners in terms of their contribution for this first year. So we'd like to separate out the infrastructure and the system cost FTEs, at least for this first year, but those spreadsheets are tied together. I mean, I suppose I could do them, again, but I just wondered if that's possible.
And Pat, what you're suggesting would require a revision to the spreadsheet to enable that, I think. The general answer to the question is that any method of allocation, FTEs or otherwise, understanding that there's encouragement for FTEs is okay as long as it's allowable under the Uniform Administrative Requirements Circular. There is the one caution probably would be an element of cost allocation, as you know, is consistency and consistent application of the basis, and so that would be something that you would need to be comfortable with if you're going to allocate costs two different ways, because a fundamental principle of cost allocation is consistent application using the same methodology. That doesn't mean you can't do it, but it does mean that you would need to have a good reason and rationale for allocating costs one way for one purpose and another way for another purpose.
Yeah, and Skip, I agree with you on that, except that my guess is that at least in the first year and potentially down the road, Title 1B is going to end up paying for most of this, and to really go by that cost allocation and doing it, what's allowable is, that's kind of not valid. I mean, we're cost allocating, but we don't have any real guarantees that anyone else is going to pay.
Pat, this is Mike. I think I understand what you're getting at, is that because in PY16, the funding mechanism can work like it has worked in the past.
Right.
So your questioning is using the same FTE allocation method, a reasonable way to do it, knowing that for this 1 year, there doesn't necessarily have to be cash tied to that.
And I'm not saying necessarily cash. I'm saying that the reality is that we're going to negotiate something that is probably less than what would be a true value on a cost allocation plan for many of our partners. Just like we've been doing all these years. I mean,
yeah, and the question is that going to be okay going forward? And I don't think anybody knows the answer to that, other than to say that the whatever the final rule looks like is maybe clarifying in some respects. I know many of us hope so, especially with regard to shared funding. But it's really, we all know how federal and state reviewers are, and it's really difficult to undergo a review and get questioned on the basis for cost allocation without having a reasonable position to defend whatever it is you've done. And to the extent, I mean, the other element, and not to get into all the detail, but the test that the feds use is relative to the benefits received. And one way of interpreting what you just said, Pat, is that there would be an over-allocation relative to the benefit received for the Title I partner, and an under-allocation relative to the benefit received for the other partners.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, that would be, and presumably would be, a strict application of the requirements and the issue that could be raised in a review, certainly by the feds and maybe by the state as well. So it's a delicate thing, and I think the answer is whatever basis of allocation that you use certainly for PY17 forward, you just need to be comfortable that you've got a reasonable argument in support of why you're doing it the way you did it. And hope. I mean, that's all you can do, is try to come up with a justification that supports what you're doing. And for PY16, it's just the guidance there is simply that you do whatever you did under WIOA, and we all know that that was far less than perfect what happened under WIOA. So.
Yeah, Pat, I would add that we can take a look at this and see what the options might be, because I'm sure there are ramifications in your question that we need to sit down as a team and think through. And then assuming that, well, depending on how that conversation goes, there could be amendments to the spreadsheet necessary. Not saying that that's the way it will go, but that might be a possibility. So
okay, thank you.
We need to think through the ramifications of your question, and especially for getting by for PY16. PY17 is entirely another animal that requires a different train of thought. But for what you're asking right now for PY16, let us convene on that and think through the issues, and we'll get back to you very shortly.
Okay, thank you.
All right, next question is the local area is the local area bound to the numbers calculated on the spreadsheet if they are in agreement with the partner contribution? So an example is if dollars come in at $5,000, but partners agree to a $2,500 contribution, then that's the agreement. So how should that be handled, I guess?
So in this example, the allocation would be $5,000 to a partner, but the cash coming in would be $2,500. And so how's that handled? Is that?
I think they're just asking if the paper doesn't match the true agreement, is that a major issue?
Well, again, we've got two time frames there. The PY17 is clear. Number one, if there's agreement in either year to an amount of money, seems to me the expectation is that amount of money would be what would be shared, not some lesser amount, because then there wasn't an agreement on the amount in the first place. So certainly for PY17 and afterwards, whatever is agreed upon, the agreement means the expectation is that payment in whatever form get made. For PY16, it's probably a little more fluid than that, and I think we all know that there have been local areas under WIOA where costs have been allocated to a partner and those payments haven't been made, and the earth hasn't stopped revolving. So again, I think we're in this little bit of a limbo for PY16. For PY17, I think it's an entirely different set of circumstances.
Yeah, part of the exercise of having everyone go through this now is that everybody can get a feel for what the costs are going to look like next year, so you have a full year to plan for that. But I agree with Skip. for PY16 there is more flexibility than there will be next year. Let's leave it at that.
Yeah. Yeah.
We've got a couple of questions coming in through the chat pod. Again, if you're so inclined, you can ask your question over the telephone. We've unmuted your lines from our end, so if you need to unmute yours to ask a question or follow up with a comment to anything that's been discussed, please feel free to use the telephone line itself.
It's pretty quiet. This is Pat Farragut. I have another question if no one else does.
Go ahead, Pat.
And it's related to the review of the budgets. So they're due this week, and then we have a relatively short time frame to finish our negotiations. I guess I'm looking for some direction on what kind of feedback we're going to be getting, or I'm not sure. Like, could this be, major changes? What? I'm just looking at my schedule of when I have partner meetings, and it's pretty tight through the month of May. So I'm wondering what kind of review is going to happen.
Okay, Pat, this is Mike. That's a great question. We are going to sit down as a team and look at the budgets and just get a feel for how everyone approached it, and we will offer feedback. It's hard to predict what kind of feedback we're going to offer without having seen all of the budgets, but we will offer back any suggestions or questions we might have if something's not clear, but it's nothing that will hold you up from proceeding. So everybody should proceed as normal. This is just kind of our way of getting a feel for how the process is playing out and better understanding the kind of issues we need to be looking at to make sure that we're providing the appropriate technical assistance when it's needed and how it's needed. And Pat, to your original question, I think it would help us to better understand and think through the issues on the two different types of allocation. If you could send us a brief mock-up of what you're thinking of doing.
Okay.
And then that would help us kind of get our heads around better what it would look like and what ramifications that would have for how the calculations play out.
Okay, I can do that.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Are there any other questions? We do have a little bit more time. I know a couple people were typing and we never did receive those questions or comments in the chat pod. I think one was coming from local area 20. I don't know who the other one was coming from. So if you
okay, Mark. I couldn't figure out how to ask the question in writing, so I'll just do it and do it over the phone. I guess I'm thinking that with the whole MOU budget spreadsheet being submitted next week, is that it's almost like I need to come up with kind of like two spreadsheets. One, the way that we're probably going to do it this year, which is based on how we did it under WIOA, and then another spreadsheet on how it's going to be for PY17, which I think is really what you really want to look at, is how it's going to play out, because they're two totally different budget ways that we're doing it. So, and we don't have an MOU in place now, so what am I supposed to do for this next year? Because we did collect money from a minimal amount of money from our partners over the years under WIOA, but I mean, it's something that we'd like to continue at least until we get this infrastructure stuff in place. So anyway, that's what I couldn't put in writing because I really didn't know how to. I didn't want to go on and on.
And just a question about what you said. are you saying that that the budget would be different between PY16 and 17, or that the allocations will be different for PY16 versus PY17, or both?
Both.
Both, okay. Yeah, in terms of a strict, and Mike can weigh in on this, but the requirement, the only requirement that is in the governor's guidelines as revised is for one preliminary budget for PY16 to be submitted by the deadline. There is no expectation that that you submit two, one for 16 and one for 17. So that wouldn't be necessary.
That's an exercise they should probably do.
Yeah, but at the same time, if you know that the budget is going to be different for 17 than it is for 16 in total, and I'm not talking about the allocations, just the total amount, then that would be good information to have. So if you had that, I would encourage you to send it, even though there's no requirement that that be done.
Yeah, my advice, Ann, would be that next year's budget and how it would be allocated is an excellent exercise that everybody ought to be doing now, just so they have a feel for what that looks like. But Skip is right. We really only need to see the PY16 budget at this point. But if anybody wants to have us look at the PY17 and how that plays out, we're happy to do that. But it's not required at this point. But again, I encourage you all to do that on your own, so at some point you will get a feel for, okay, if we did it next year's way this year, here's how it would break out. So that way everybody understands what the expectations next year will be, based on what this year's budget looks like. That's a great thought, Ann.
Okay, any other questions? If not, we're going to move to the last couple slides on today's presentation.
This last slide, and I'm not sure what the protocol is here, Mark, but rather than people here figure out what it is you have questions about, I think the thought is to get your input on what areas or what questions you would like to see under the spotlight for the May 11th webinar. Today it was FTEs, but again, these primarily are opportunities for you to ask questions. So if there's a particular area that you would like covered in a presentation sense in the webinar scheduled for May 11th, would ask that you send those areas to Christy Jones at KEB, and we can build a brief, short presentation around those areas that you're most interested in, rather than guessing areas that you have the highest interest. So I would encourage you to do that. There's no, we can accept those all the way up till the Monday before, so that would be the 9th. So if you have some specific thoughts of topics you'd like covered, please send those to Christy Jones at KEB.
Yeah, so what Skip's saying is we've already dedicated the May 11th WIOA Wednesday webinar to another follow-up of this nature, just to ensure we continue to address your concerns. We just want to address other topics if necessary. So please send those to Christy, and then we'll build that May 11th webinar around those questions to ensure that you're prepared fully for what you have going forward beyond that date.
And then the final slide is just, again, information that you should already have. And these are the contacts. If you have questions specific about the MOU or cost negotiations, these are the individuals that correspond to each partner that you should be asking your questions of. These are being coordinated at the state level, but if you're if you're an adult ed provider, for example, and have a question about MOUs or cost negotiations, then the person to whom you should ask that question is LaVon Nelson and at ICCB. So this slide just shows who it is that's been designated from each partner as the individual to whom you should ask your questions. And again, those questions are being shared at a state level among the partners and coordinated, but they originate with the partner that that is attached to the person asking the question.
Okay, we do not have a topic designated for next week. That doesn't mean in the next day or two we might not decide on something, but for at this point in time, until you see additional guidance from Christy Jones, we'll let you know by close of business probably tomorrow whether there will be a webinar next week and what that topic is, if so. And then I think what we need to do is kind of regroup amongst ourselves and determine beyond May 11th what topics are most important to go forward. I know we've been getting a lot of positive feedback from core partners, and they're getting that from their grantees and customers and that. Also from the local areas through the Illinois Workforce Partnership. Even our board has been very complimentary to us holding these webinars. We appreciate all the assistance and coordination by KB staff. So I think we want to continue these. We're just at a point now where we really need to sit down and set a plan going forward beyond the middle of May. And I think maybe we'll discuss sending out a survey to everyone that gets these emails of some sort that says, you know, provide us feedback on the things you would want to hear first as we go forward, whether we do that in just an email or maybe a survey monkey with a bunch of topics already listed that you can choose from and maybe rank. We'll determine that also in the next few days and get something out. We want to make sure, you know, these are valuable to you, that we're not setting up a time in your schedule each Wednesday and then it's a time that could have been better used somewhere else. And so we want to make sure we get input from everybody, not just our local partners for Title I, but also everyone that's been participating in these from all of our titles. It's been, you know, I've been pleasantly surprised by the number of people we continue to get calling in and getting on these webinars. And so I would like to continue these. I know we would like to continue these. And we just want to, again, make sure we have topics set up that meet your needs. So look also for another email in the near future that indicates how we will request your input on continuing topics for the webinar. Other than that, I appreciate your joining us today. Thank you, Skip and Christy, for joining us. And we look forward to having either next week or at the latest the May 11th as our next webinar. Thank you.